All right, welcome to the third session of our church history boot camp. This boot camp is designed to give you 4 sessions of church history, going through the entirety of all of church history in 4 sessions. Again, I'm Michael Patton, Tim Kimberly. We're at the Credo House. We're really excited about this one, Reformation stuff. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is the Reformation. Now, Tim, we've been carrying this theme.
Yep.
Whenever we go through this, kind of this development theme that we got our DNA whenever the apostles once for all handed our faith over to the saints. Jesus handed it to the apostles handed it over to us. Since then, we have been delivering this. We have been discharging the gospel. The gospel was given to us in DNA form. We see the church in development. I like to see it this way, that we have gone through periods that are wonderful periods, discovery periods, and also some periods that aren't so wonderful.
Yeah.
Periods that are really difficult for us to work through. We try to encourage us, and I think this is one of the unique things about this particular church history boot camp, which we're trying to encourage you to find yourself in church history. Do not just say, oh, that's whenever the church went bad and I'm not a part of that. That's just like saying whenever you look at a picture of yourself whenever you're a teenager, oh, that's not me. And I've seen people do that before, That wasn't me. Last night, we were at the hospital. My mother got in a car accident, and she's okay. But we were all gathered together with all of us kids, all of my mother's kids, and we were talking. And you know how you get together with brothers and sisters, and sooner or later you start telling memories. Well, we got to the subject of who was the worst teenager. Okay. And it was a close battle, okay, because all of us had really good stories to tell about how we were not so good, and apologizing to Mom while she's laying there. Mom, I'm sorry. This is time to tell you I'm sorry. I think sometimes we go through those periods where we have this kind of weird period in our lives, and then we look back upon that and we reflect, and not only do we say we're sorry, but we have learned a lot from that. We've learned a lot from our mistakes and from our failures. And I think that's the way God has designed development. Every life stage presents us with new difficulties, new ways to sin, new ways to show off our fallen nature, but also new ways to grow and develop and to learn from ourselves. And we're looking back as we move into this period we call the Reformation, and we like to think of it as kind of the 20s. We've gone out of our teen years, and suddenly we begin to realize, hey, we didn't know it all whenever we were in our teens like we thought. And we have to go back and apologize a few times to Mom and Dad and say, listen, I'm sorry I said that, you didn't know as much as me about this particular thing. And we begin to see wisdom in other things, but not in ourselves. We change. Yeah. We reform.
Yeah.
And we're entering into that time period.
Yeah. I'm thankful that we're leaving our teenage years, and those are our teenage years, but now we're getting into times that great things happen, heroic things happen. Heroic things have been happening through all of this, but I think this is a time period that you will really start clinging on to some heroes. You'll see some more villains, but I think there'll be some great heroes there. But it didn't happen overnight. And this is what we talk there as we go into the Reformation, a time period that all of us, we should teach our kids about the Reformation and the heroes of the Reformation. But if you miss the stuff that led up to it, it's like showing someone a clip of a movie and you show them the climactic battle scene. And you say, wasn't that awesome? I just saved you 2 hours of watching a movie because I just showed you the climactic battle scene. You're like, no, I missed all of the stuff that led up to it, and it wasn't such a bang as it was for you because you saw everything that led up to it. And not being able to see what's leading up to the Reformation, we have to look at this stuff because this is what's going to give us the backdrop that will hopefully allow us to say, wow, can you believe what they did?
We're going to back up a few years before the Reformation and see what happened. Because we left this last time kind of at the church growing, the church protecting, the church visible, the church as an institution getting armed up to protect the gospel from all the bad guys. But we have some problems that arise. We're going to talk about internal and external preparation for the Reformation. Internal preparation, as it'll become defined as we move through it. But
which is internal to the church. So things that happened inside the church that prepared us for the Reformation, then things are happening outside the church walls that are preparing us for Reformation.
As the institution of the church has risen since last time, you have the gospel beginning to be lost because of the institution's authority itself. the authority of the church, and we talked last time about all of the ways in which you had to do things in order to be accepted before God and receive grace. And the church became the deposit of grace to where it gave grace. So you would have to come to the pastor and to the priest and receive the grace rather than going straight to God. Why? Because we're trying to protect God. We don't want you messing things up. We don't want you having bad doctrine. We've been through it before. We're protecting. You would think that immediately everybody would start raising their hand in protest and saying, hey, what's going on? Why does it take till the Reformation before Martin Luther, as we'll see in a little bit, comes on the scene and is the father of the Reformation and begins this tidal wave that changes the church? Why didn't it change beforehand? Why did we let it go so long with this kind of corruption, this influence that was growing more and more to where we didn't know grace any longer, to where grace wasn't found, where it was so hard to find God because you had to go through so many hoops and do so many confessions and show up to church so many times and it just became this process that became unattainable and people were they didn't know what to do. We do have a few people that stood up and raised their hands.
Yeah, John Wycliffe, this guy is a stud. He is an awesome, energetic guy. I mean, this is a likable Oxford professor. The students love him.
Does that mean most Oxford professors aren't likable?
Yeah. Well, any school, you're going to have professors that people gravitate to more than others.
Yeah.
And so,
he's the one that everybody wanted to take his class, right?
Yeah, people loved Wycliffe. But he did something that seems normal for us, but I realize this is putting your life on the line type stuff. This is sticking your neck out there type stuff. He challenged the authority of the Pope. And remember before, we got to the point where, remember all the list of all those years of different things that happened with the church, and one of them was that anything the Pope said was infallible or without error. So for a beloved Oxford professor to say, no, I don't believe that he has that authority, is a big deal. And then this is a huge deal. He is a hero of ours for one reason, too, is that he started translating the Bible into English, which was officially against the law. Because if you just give people a Bible, you can't control what ideas are going to happen in their head. But he said, no, I'm going to actually give it to them. A lot of the regular run-of-the-mill people did not speak the language of Latin that the Bible was in. They spoke English. And what he said is, let's start translating this into English.
Challenged the authority of the Pope, said that the church has become saturated with immorality. It became rampant. Said that the Bible was actually above the church, in front of the church. The church is not in front of the Bible protecting it, but the Bible's in front of the church protecting it, which was, by that time, the last few hundred years, that was saying something.
Yeah, and you might think that's normal. Oh yeah, all this stuff sounds normal to me. Well, it's because of Wycliffe that it sounds normal to you, and people like him that followed in his footsteps. Wycliffe died a natural death, but what's really interesting is that his ideas spread, and were spreading amongst people. People are like, yeah. That the church, the institutional church of the day, got so mad and so upset at Wycliffe that they actually dug up his bones after he died and burned his bones and took the ashes and threw them in the river because they were so upset at the influence that Wycliffe was having in turning the hearts and the minds of people towards the Bible and towards Christ.
Now you would think, if you're mad at somebody, that's not probably a thought that has come to your mind, right?
Yeah. But remember, throughout church history, the reason that people usually burn people at the stake and crush their bones and all that stuff was because Christians professed the resurrection. And they thought that was the ultimate insult, is that if I burn you at the stake and pulverize your body, good luck having Jesus raise you from the dead, and you won't be in heaven with him. And we can say, well, I mean, if God's going to raise a dead person, he has no problem if they're ashes or whatever, But that is the ultimate insult of what they're trying to do, is say, Wycliffe, we are digging you up so that you will have no chance of resurrection. So.
John Huss was the next guy to raise his hand. He was a professor of philosophy. He had similar complaints with the church. He said that Christ, not the Pope, is the head of the church. And he called on the church to evaluate its practice of simony. Now, simony, what is that? So it's named after a guy named Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician.
Which we have him in Heretics Corner.
We do have him in Heretics Corner. Irenaeus called him the father of all heresies. But Simon Magus, for the thing that he did was he tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit from Peter. And whenever he saw Peter laying his hands upon people and the Holy Spirit coming upon them, and Peter basically said, "May your money perish with you."
Yeah.
But that became simony, buying churches, buying pastorates, buying power.
Yeah. Hey, I'll be Pope. How much?
Yeah.
I mean, that was the question.
And it became a business, How can I make my son get into a position to where he will be a bishop and then a cardinal and then possibly a pope? Well, it took money many times. Yeah. He eventually was condemned and burned at the stake, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we're trying to show there are people that were standing up, raising their hands. It wasn't just something out of the blue. There were followers, as Tim said. There was something going on. There was change happening. We were moving into our 20s, and everybody was beginning to slowly mature and say, this stuff doesn't work. It's not working.
Can I tell a story about Huss real quick with his death?
Yeah, or you can save it to the picture I have of him.
Okay, go ahead.
The fall of papacy. Let's talk about this for a little bit, because we talked about the zenith of the papacy beforehand and how it grew and grew and grew. The zenith of the papacy comes around the 13th century. And at this point, you have rulers of the land. You got to understand this. Remember, the Pope is the primary authority in all the land. Yes, there are emperors. Yes, there are kings. Yes, there are leaders. But essentially, he holds salvation for your people. And if he cuts your land off, your people don't have salvation. If he says, hey, your priests, they no longer have legitimate Eucharist. Whenever they give out the bread and wine, whenever they bless it, it doesn't turn into the body and blood anymore because I said it didn't. I cut you off. And so it was this process of staying in line with the Pope a lot of times that the kings and the emperors and the princes were trying to do. So people were scared. Nationality was not like it was today. We'll see a change. Mm-hmm. However, something weird happens. Something fun and exciting to tell about, I think, because it prepares for the Reformation, but also it's just a bizarre thing that happens in church history.
Yeah. And remember, too, there is no Roman Catholic Church at this time. We've had the split from our last session between Eastern Orthodoxy and the Western Church. So when we say Pope, that starts in this session. Roman Catholic Church starts in this session. But right now we're just talking the leader of the Western Church when we say Pope.
We have one Pope, right? At this time in 1377, there was one Pope. However, something begins to change that at this time. We have a guy named Clement V who lives in France, and he becomes the next Pope. Now, Clement likes France, likes it a lot, doesn't want to leave there, doesn't want to pick up his kids and pick up his house and all his belongings and move to Rome. And France is really the place to live in this day. It was the prime real estate. The king at this time was the most powerful king in the land, the richest land. They were building up more and more as far as their military. So he wants to stay there in France, Avignon.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you lived in Paris and then say, hey, your job's going to move you to some random town in the middle of nowhere. And you say, nah, I think I'll stay here. I mean, there's all these benefits in Paris, and there's none of those benefits there, and I just love life here.
Clement decides to stay in Paris, and after him we have 7 popes that stay there. So this is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the Pope, because the papacy was taken somewhere else, and how in the world can you have a Pope that's not in Rome? It was completely scandalizing to the papacy just to have the papacy, and whenever I say the papacy, that means the office of the Pope, just to have the office of the Pope outside of Rome.
Which would be the same for us too. I mean, we get a new president that's elected that is from L.A., and he says, you know what, I'm just going to stay in L.A. Let's just move the White House down here. And it's like, no, you can't do that. And that's the same feeling that they were having at this time.
Over here, luxuries galore, partying galore. I mean, immorality begins to run rampant in the papacy. He moves all of his guys and keeps them there. The cardinals all stay there in Avignon as well. And, I mean, they're just living it up. No real thought of spirituality anymore. It's just been transferred to this lifestyle. And people are scratching their heads saying, what is going on with our pastorate? What is going on with with our religion and our faith.
Yeah.
So, what happens next? Well, Gregory becomes Pope, and Gregory the Seventh, he's a good guy, and he wants to reform everything. You have a lot of these good bishops of Rome during this time, but you're increasingly getting worse and worse. Ever read through Chronicles and First and Second Chronicles, First and Second Kings, and you see an increased corruption. Very rarely do you see somebody that becomes king and it says, and he followed the Lord with his whole heart.
Yeah. You see Josiah or something, you're like, oh.
Yeah.
But then it gets worse after him than it was even before him.
And it's the same thing going on here. Gregory was a good guy. He tried to reform, but he only lived a few months. But we're back in Rome, okay? Hang on to this.
But it's such a frustrating
70 years.
Such a frustrating thing of church history, though. It's like, oh, we got a good guy, and he's dead. And now what are we going to do? That's kind of the way it is.
He's in Rome. The people are sick. They've been tired of having the captivity of the Pope, and so the people begin a riot in the streets around the Vatican and demand that the cardinals, they demand it. If the cardinals don't do this, they're fearing for their lives. They demand that we get an Italian Pope so that he would stay here. So they did. Right after this, we had Urban VI. And Urban VI was a good guy as well. Okay? Good guy number 2. And so he says, all right, here we go, guys. Let's clean house. Let's fix everything. From now on, no more parties. From now on, no more big houses. From now on, no more illegitimate children, illegitimate concubines, and all this stuff that was going on. As a matter of fact, we're going to move back to an ascetic lifestyle to where we practice not self-indulgence, but keeping away from everything that the world has to offer. Mm-hmm. Now you have a culture of the papacy and the cardinals who are getting told by this new pope, we're cleaning house. These guys do not like it.
They're not ready to clean their house.
No, they elected him, but here's what they said. They said there's a rule, because you got to understand, once you elect a pope, it's not that easy to get the pope out. You got to find some type of loophole to get him out in the laws, the canon laws.
Because remember, anything that he says is true.
Yeah.
So you could say, you need to leave. No, I don't, and that's true.
So the cardinals want to go back to France, and they say, here's the loophole we found. You cannot have a pope elected under duress. We were under duress by the crowds. He's an illegitimate pope. We got a new one. So our new pope is Clement VII, and we're going back to Party Town. Okay? And so they all go back to Party Town, and Clement VII is there. All right, finally we're all back. However, there's a problem. Urban doesn't relinquish his claim to the papacy. So he says, I'm pope. And Clement says, no, I'm pope. I've been elected by the cardinals. So now we have 2 popes. For 40 years. 40 years we have 2 popes. Now, I say that, and I say that with a bit of intensity because I'm sitting there thinking, you got to understand what this means. You got to understand the unrest this is causing in the people. You got to understand the internal preparation that is going on for change. If we can have 2 popes, it's not established like we thought it was. It's not the stable foundation. And they don't even know, and there's arguments going on which one is the pope. Instability creates an opportunity for change.
Yeah, you've built your life on this solid foundation, and you start seeing this crack, and it's going to get bigger.
Civil leaders now at this time, listen to this. The kings, leaders, mayors, they're saying, well, who do we pay allegiance to? Who do we like the most? So they begin to go to each pope and say, hey, what will you give us? How much leniency will you give us? How much taxes do we have to pay to you? And so they begin to barter back and forth. And then all of a sudden, the people's loyalty, they don't know where to go. It used to be to the Pope, but now it seems to be a national. And this is the rise of national loyalty as we know it today. National loyalty begins to be transferred from the papacy and the way that it was structured at that time to the actual kingdoms, to the actual countries and states.
And don't gloss over that if you miss that. One of the reasons why when we're watching the Olympics or whatever it may be, and we get that national swell of pride, a lot of that comes from these 2 popes. Truly comes from these 2 popes starting to do things where people stop having their pride be in their affiliation with God, and their pride more be in a national, localized zone. And so a lot of these songs, I'm proud to be American, stuff like that, a lot of that can find its genesis in this dispute.
Okay, so now we're going to solve this. The Council of Pisa meets together, 1409, says we've got to figure out what's going on. They come together and they say, both those popes no longer popes. But we've got Alexander V. He's the legitimate pope. Done. It's over with. Man, that was bad time. Shoo. Right?
Glad that's over.
Yeah, but neither one of the guys will relinquish his throne. So now we've got 1, 2, 3 popes. What do we do now? Now, again, the only reason we do this is not because it's interesting,
yeah.
but
or
to
mock like the church, or to mock this time period, because at least one of these people and the people of the day are loving God the best that they know how to, but that you can really see the atmosphere of the day and see the way that people are viewing their church. That at one time they were saying, whatever the Pope says, I'm taking it to the bank. And now they're starting to be like, well, I'm not so sure because I have 3 popes now. And did God really appoint all 3 of them, and are they all infallible?
It's like going to the doctor, and you only have one doctor your whole life.
Yeah.
And he says every time exactly what it is that's the matter with you, and that's all you have. But then you have another doctor, and he tells you something different. You're like, well, which one's the authority? Then a third doctor, and then all of a sudden, you just don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, Council of Constance meets together. This is the same council.
Yeah.
You want to go with this?
John Huss.
John Huss.
Yeah.
15th Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church today recognizes 21 official ecumenical councils. You and I, as Protestant evangelicals, if you're a Protestant evangelical, you probably hold to 2, 3, possibly 7 with some footnotes.
Yeah. In this council, though, one of the things that they do is that John Huss is sentenced to death. Well, in here, his death is interesting because the statement, your goose is cooked, if you've ever heard that before, is related to John Huss. Because in Czech, his name means goose. And so when they told the Queen of England that John Huss had been executed because of what he was proclaiming about freedom in Christ, they told the Queen by telling her, your goose has been cooked. And that's where in history that comes from. And here he is condemned at this council as well as they're trying to figure out what to do with these 3 popes.
They finally figured out what to do. Say, get rid of them all 3 again, and we're electing Martin. The next slide is not funny.
No.
Martin actually stays the single pope. However, this does not reform the papacy. I mean, we're beyond that. It's just deep in corruption at this point. This is where you got the Borgia family that comes in and it has the papacy, and he appoints his very young, I think under 10-year-old son to be cardinal, and he has illegitimate children all over the place. Alexander. This is where you just have the expression of the Renaissance excitement coming to the papacy and being expressed through the papacy. Yeah. Pope Leo X, who was pope during the time that Martin Luther comes on the scene, said, God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. It became a time to enjoy. So we move from session 1, where we're talking about all of the apostles dying, Peter upside down on a cross, beforehand calling on his wife as she's hanging on a cross, remember Christ. We have Thomas, who is speared. We have James, who is thrown from the top of the temple. But now we have an enjoyment.
And it's not enjoying in a holy, righteous way. It's enjoying in any temptation that you have. Just live life fully in your flesh type way.
Going on inside the church. Now let's look outside the church. What is happening outside the church?
If that weren't enough to necessitate Reformation, we've got a lot that's happening outside the doors that are shaking the world and turning upside down too.
We have a 100-year war between England and France. Now, this is very important because whenever you have England and France going at a war and you have the papacy being moved to France, England is less inclined to like the institutional church. So give me a chance and I'll break away. So they're ready to break away from the church. Black Death.
Yeah, I mean, this is Book of Revelation, Book of Daniel type stuff, that in this time period too, the Black Death comes up. So, I mean, in the midst of the popes, all that stuff happening, here we see around in Europe, 1/3, 1/2 of Europe's entire population dies. I mean, imagine that. In any town, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the people die. For 120 years, there's outbreaks. I mean, you have shakiness inside the church, But imagine this shakiness. I mean, everybody has family members. Everybody has kids that have died in this. And by 1450, Europe's entire population is down 70%. 70% have died by 1450. The dance of death was part. I mean, it was just who is the Grim Reaper going to dance with this hour? Was a lot of the questions of that day. And I mean, think what that does in turning your world upside down, thinking that's the end of the world, if 70% of the population has died recently.
Now, we talk a lot about things that go on here, maybe in America or maybe somewhere around the world. Economic collapses, difficulties finding jobs, job rate being above 10%, rising above 10%, be in fear of that.
Can you believe Netflix was down for an hour? Like, how can we live?
It is the end times.
Yeah.
But nothing compares to this, folks. Nothing. Nothing compares to the mood it created. Reason why I put the Dance Macabre here is because this was the artwork. This was what everybody drew. A lot of people talk about the darkness that you see in today's kids, wearing dark things and feeling dark and seeming dark. This was a lot worse. Yeah. Everybody was dark because the world was dark.
That's right.
Now, what is that? Why is that up here? Because during this time, you're looking to somebody to help. And whenever you have a corrupt church institution and you're calling upon your pastor and you're saying, hey, I think my son has the plague. Johnny, can you go down the street and get Pastor George? He comes back and he says, Pastor George is gone. Where'd he go? I don't know. They say he went to some safe haven. Everywhere, the religious people are fleeing. Now, I'm not saying there weren't some people that stayed and died. Mm-hmm. But you're starting to see who really believes what they believe and how they believe it. And suffering brings that out in every one of us. Suffering is the great test of our faith. And this is the entire world being tested at this point. And the religious system is falling apart. I mean, you don't have 90% of the people and just 10% of them going away. You have maybe 10% hanging out, being real. And the other ones that had bought their office, if you bought your office, you're not sticking around and dying with your people.
And there are wonderful stories, wonderful history nuggets in this time period of everyone is fleeing away from a town that has just been overcome by the plague, and there are Christians that are walking into the town just to care for the sick and the dying because of the dignity of every human made in the image of God. So there are wonderful heroic stories in this time period, but overall the church is looking very bad and life is looking really bad.
The institutionalized church is becoming irrelevant. Now we have Islam. Islam had made its way to Constantinople a few times, but we finally have Islam make the break through Constantinople, and you have the Christians fleeing. Many of them fleeing to the west, into Rome and to other Western nations, but you also have them going north to Russia, and that's why you have current Russian Orthodoxy, and Russia being, I think, the biggest Eastern Orthodox country in the world with 90 million. But the point here is, whenever they run out of this area, they bring treasures into the West. Treasures of manuscripts and ancient writings from Aristotle and Plato and just a lot of things that they hadn't really seen before.
Yeah.
Now, this would make no difference if we did not have this.
Yeah, this is the beauty of the printing press. So imagine this, before 1440, generally speaking, every single book before 1440 was handwritten. Imagine that. Every book that someone would have in their hand before 1440 for all civilization was handwritten. Then Gutenberg, he doesn't invent the printing press in some ways, but what he does is he takes all of these great components, puts them together in a printing press that is quick, is cheap, where you can mass produce things very, very quickly. And so it's almost like what it was in the 1990s in America and other places where the internet is finally coming about. We have this immense amount of information for the first time flooding into us. And that is exactly what it was like at this time period. Huge amounts of information are coming from the East, pushed by Islam, but then now the printing press is able to disseminate that in a cheap way, and it really facilitated a revival for learning. People didn't have to just get word of mouth from other people, or the rich people owned books, or you had to know Latin to read books. For the first time now, anyone can have learning right at their fingertips.
Whenever the computers first came out, or personal computers back in the 80s, I remember I had an Apple IIe, I think it was.
Yeah, I have one in my office still.
Yeah? Apple IIe?
I think it's the 2E.
No, it's not. I'd recognize it if it was.
Yeah.
But I used to play games on it, and I can navigate it. I was pretty proficient on a computer, the kind of expected proficiency, because I had a reason to do it. You get into the 90s, early 90s, personal computers become more available. Mm-hmm. We get one, and I have a nice one, and I always tried to show my dad stuff, and he had no clue how to use this and didn't care about it. And every time he'd get on the computer, he's just mad, and call on me to help him with something, and just basically write off the computer. And that's what a lot of people did. They just wrote it off and said, I'll never do it. I'll pass this phase. But whenever the internet came out, it kind of forced everybody to learn the computer. Mm-hmm. Now my dad's very proficient on it. He can do just about anything that I can do on it. Because there's a reason now. There's a definite reason for people to learn that. This gave everybody a reason to learn to read. Everybody was reading. Mm-hmm. Everybody was learning to read. It was an enlightenment. That's what we call it. The Enlightenment. The age of learning. The age of reason. Great Reformation. Tell us about Martin Luther.
Oh, man. Martin Luther is a character. I mean, he is probably the type of guy that would probably get kicked out of most churches in America today. Yeah. I mean, he is a German guy. I mean, if you think of the of the prototypical German beer drinking, swearing guy, I mean, that's Martin Luther. But he was a guy that was wanting to be as close to God as he could possibly be. And he was very, very, very concerned with his sin. That was a big thing. He was obsessed with his sin. The type of guy, we have people at the Credo House that email us all the time, call us all the time. I've done these sins. Can I have forgiveness? What do I have to do? What do I have to do to make sure that I'm going to get to heaven?
I've committed the unforgivable sin.
Yeah. Oh, what do I do now? And then they'll call over and over and over again.
Doubting their salvation. Am I really saved? I don't know because I've done this or I think this.
And that was Martin Luther.
If Martin Luther was today, I mean, this is certainly, I'm not making any statement here one way or the other, but what I'm saying is that we would have put him on some drugs. We really would have.
Yeah.
Calm down. We've got a pill for that.
He would yell at Satan. I mean, all these things.
Threw his ink bottle at Satan a few times. Whipped himself. Continually.
His passion was getting rid of the guilt of his sin.
Tell us about his childhood, whenever he was in Latin class.
Oh man! So his parents, his learning about Luther is delightful. You can learn so many things. But his dad was a coal miner and ended up owning his own coal company. But his parents wanted a better life for him and his siblings, and so they enrolled him starting very early. At the age of 4 years old, they enrolled him in a Latin school, where you would actually be beaten if you spoke German during the day. Okay? Because they want you to only learn Latin. And can I share? Is it okay to share what they would say?
I like it.
You like it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Luther-esque.
It's Luther-esque, very much. So this is how Luther grew up, is that in his school, they would, at the age of 4, that they're teaching them Latin, they would, what they would do is you would be beaten if you spoke German at all. And then the student in his class, 4 years old, the student that performed the most poor that day would be called an ass all day long.
That was his name.
That was the name. They would not call them by their name. They would call
a donkey ass in that sense.
Yeah, but I mean that's what they is the ass here. I mean that's Martin Luther's. That's what he's growing up under, and this German hard, firm schooling, but he excels. I mean, he didn't want to be beat and called bad names, but he truly excels academically, so concerned with his sin that his advisor, that he becomes a monk naturally. I want all in. What is the most all in that I can be? Well, you could be a monk and live in a monastery and just be concerned with scrubbing the floor and praying. and getting rid of your sin in the way that we tell you to.
But remember, think of this. I mean, this is the culture that had become in the church. There was always something to do. There was always being better. There was always some more confession that you could have. There was always some more beating that you could have. There was always some more isolation that you could get yourself to. And it's always thinking, what can I do to resolve this? And let me pause here and give a little sermon. That's sometimes we think. Grace is the most difficult thing to accept in this world. Grace is the stumbling block of the gospel. Grace is so crazy that when we get to it, and he makes his discovery, that this do stuff, this list of things that you can do to make yourself better, to be found righteous in God's sight, is beyond the sight of anybody in the church today. And so, what's the next thing? Well, I'm driving down. I'm in a rainstorm, and I'm riding on my horse. Luther was. He gets in a rainstorm, and he's scared. He's on his way back to
law school.
Law school?
Yeah, so there was no Social Security at this time. So if your parents wanted you to be a lawyer so that you could make a lot of money, so that you could basically be the Medicare, 401k, Social Security of your parents. And so for you to ever go against that is basically telling your parents, good luck. I hope that you're able to find a way to survive. And Luther is caught in a thunderstorm, and for whatever reason, and he says, if you let me, he actually prays to a saint, but he says, if you let me live, I will become a monk.
And that's the thought process. If you do that, here's the deal, God, I'm going to barter with you. Have you ever bartered with God? This is what he's living in, bartering with God. If I do this, will you do this? If I do this, will you love me more? If I do this, can I be saved? However, he is commissioned to study the New Testament.
Yeah, so they say, well, maybe you can teach theology. Maybe if you teach theology, you'll even out a little bit and you won't be so crazy about your sin. And so while he was preparing, he read the book of Romans.
And in Romans, he comes across this passage. Romans 1:17, for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed. It is a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And Martin Luther hated the righteousness of God. That was the main thing he hated all his life. Because the righteousness of God was what kept the list coming, the beatings coming, the names placed upon him all day at school coming. The righteousness of God was what demanded upon him to make himself more and more righteous. While reading this, he had a great discovery. And he said, you know what? The righteousness from God is not the righteousness by which he requires us to be righteous, but the righteousness by which he makes us righteous. It's an imputed righteousness. This is the discovery. And it happened. Can I tell my story?
Oh, tell it, brother.
It happened from Luther's testimony. It happened while he was on the toilet.
And archaeologists have found his toilet.
They have. Excavated it. We got pictures of it.
He had a very modern toilet for that time period.
Luther had problems, digestive problems.
Stomach issues.
So it's no surprise that he found it while he was on his toilet. Might be a surprise that he didn't find it while he was on his toilet.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. Martin Luther says, oh my gosh, this is not a righteousness that I have to fight for and work for. This is a righteousness that is given freely by God. It's God's very righteousness given to me. It's not my clothes being put in the washer over and over again until finally my clothes are clean enough that I can stand before God. It is that God says, I got some new clothes for you, and they're Jesus' clothes, and you can wear those.
And take your clothes off and put his on. I mean,
how often are we putting our clothes in the washer over and over again like Martin Luther? But that's grace. You actually are seen complete in the righteousness of Jesus. It is as if whenever you trust in Jesus, it is as if you lived your life because you can never, ever do enough. Martin Luther is the testimony to someone who can never, ever do enough. So those of you here, you're fighting for that. You're trying to do more and more and more and trying to get yourself to the point where you can finally present yourself to be God. You never will. That's why the cross happened. Martin Luther discovers this and says, the cross happened so that I could stand before God, not in my own righteousness, but the righteousness of God.
Because Luther even says, he says, if I could attain salvation by my works, I would have been the first one in. I mean, he recognized he outworked all of us. But what the beauty of is that he was able to see freedom for the first time, and freedom for his soul by Christ. And as this has happened, this is one of those moments in history where it's totally obvious that God has a sense of humor.
It's a perfect storm.
It's a perfect storm. All these things are coming together, and then it just happens that probably one of the biggest jerks of the church ever is driving into his town while he is having this freedom. Johann Tetzel, villain. Luther, hero. Tetzel, villain. Tetzel is charged with raising money all over the world to be able to fund the building of St. Peter's Basilica. This monster building, okay? So they send Tetzel, go everywhere, and here's our fundraising campaign strategy, okay? Our campaign strategy is tell people that the Pope has the ability to sell an indulgence. And what that indulgence will be is that your grandma that has passed away is in purgatory. And she is suffering there, and she will suffer until she is allowed to be in heaven. So, the Pope has special indulgences that if you give $100, then you could get your grandma out of purgatory. But perhaps if you give $1,000, you could get her out of purgatory a lot faster. And this is a win-win situation because we're getting we're getting the Church of God built on earth. We're getting a new church in Rome, and your grandma is getting out of purgatory, and you get the benefit of that. Help us help you.
It's just upsell after upsell too.
Yeah.
Because if you buy this for yourself, why not buy also for your kids and for grandma and for your wife? And then it became what's called a plenary indulgence. They used to be the indulgences were just for individual sins and problems you have. But this one time offer, folks. One time. Okay?
And
it's not going to be here tomorrow.
And Luther, his eyes are being awakened to the power of the gospel of Christ. And he is recognizing that freedom is found only in Christ Jesus, his Savior. And Tetzel pulls into town, knocks on the door of... Luther is a pastor of the church of that town. Tetzel starts knocking on the door of the people in his church who can't afford it, and they're giving their life savings to Tetzel. Talk about making a German mad. Okay, you messed with the wrong German when you walked into Luther's town, and Tetzel did also, he burned his hand really bad to show what it's like for flesh to be burned in hell. He was using all these scare tactics to get people to just give money, and he also had a song.
When the coin and the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Isn't that great? Should we do that for the Credo House?
If you got a good song, if you got a good cheer,
we might be able to build a new Credo House real quick that way. Build on this one. We could try it.
It should be, yeah.
Now, here's the fun part about this is that I said this for years, and I've been teaching on it for years, and I began to wonder, wait a minute, that's in English, and it rhymes in English. And I'm always questioning the things that I'm teaching, whether it's legitimate or where the sources come back
Since you usually teach wrong things.
Yeah, that's right.
Once in a while I got to correct myself.
Yeah, half the stuff is good here.
Is that the stuff I'm teaching?
Chill. So I looked it up in German to see what the original was, and indeed, look, klingt, springt. Huh?
Yeah, it actually rhymes too. An amazing thing about St. Peter's, do you mind real quick? St. Peter's, just to give you a size of the size or a scope of the size of this thing, they had the view. One of the things that did, Martin Luther went and saw this being constructed when he was there. It cost in today's money $2 billion to construct this thing. It's the largest interior of any church on the planet. And one of the reasons is because the view was that there always must be a church standing in Rome. Okay? So you can't just tear the sucker down and be like, oh, where's the church in Rome? Well, it used to be there, but we're pouring the foundation for the new one. You can't do that. So what they decided to do was that they built St. Peter's Basilica where the main area, the sanctuary, whatever you call it, was over the top of the old church. So there was a time in history where you could walk into St. Peter's Basilica, and after you've entered the front door, you see the old church. The old church is actually built inside, or the new church is built on the outside of that. And then once this church was complete, they then dismantled the old church and carried it out the front door. To let you know the size and the scope. And this is the money that they're raising to be able to build this thing that now we fly all over the world and see. But at the same time, they're raising the money for this, and Luther was saying, this is not what it's about.
Finally, Luther went public. It's called the nailing of the 95 Theses. We actually have the castle doors of Wittenberg back here. These are the actual doors. We were able to have them. No, actually, we called the castle itself to ask them what the doors looked like because we did want to create replicas of them, but it burned down too quickly, so nobody even there that worked there knows what they look like. Right now, it's just bronze doors with the 95 Theses written all over it. But 95 Theses nailed to the castle doors of Wittenberg. Why was it nailed there? Because it was just a common thing. You have your moose for sale. Nail it up there.
Yeah. It's kind of like the Facebook wall of your town.
Yeah.
That's just where you nail everything that you want people to know.
He nails it up there, and he's ready for debate, discussion, creates it in Latin because it's just a common discussion, theological discussion that he wants to have. He's not trying to advertise this. He's not trying to start a Reformation. However, printing press is invented. The time is ripe. Unrest, unsettlement, soil is ready for anything. People come up, grab it off there, take it, put it on the printing press, translate it, and all of a sudden it's all over the world. 95 Theses. What is the 95 Theses? 95 complaints against the church of the day. The Pope. Few of them here. The Pope cannot remit guilt, but only declare and confirm that it has been remitted by God.
Now remember, Luther's writing this as a professor of a seminary of a church. So he's preparing new people to lead the church, and here he's calling out the leader of the church. So this isn't something that you just lightly sit down and bust out a memo. These are 95 bullet points of reform that must happen for people to discover Christ.
There's no divine authority for saying that a soul can get out of purgatory. Listen to this, 82. Why does not the Pope liberate everyone from purgatory for the sake of love? If the Pope has the power, just get everybody out.
Yeah. Why does he need to make a transaction? Why does he have to sell it? He even says here, he says, meanwhile, he redeems innumerable souls for money, a most perishable thing with which to build St. Peter's Church, a very minor purpose. So he's saying, is someone's eternal soul, should it be tied to money, which is tied to a building on earth? Why is the Pope making such trivial decisions about someone's soul? Why doesn't, if he has this power, why doesn't he just say, everyone get out and everybody go? He's saying, wouldn't that be the most loving thing for the Pope to do?
Finally, the church calls him. They get sick of him. They can't take it. Who in the world does this guy think he is? He's another Huss. We'll take care of him like we did Wycliffe and Huss. Burn his bones if necessary. We call him to the Diet of Worms. At the Diet of Worms, we have the emperor. We have the charges that are brought against him. All of his books laying on the table as he walks in ready for debate, not for condemnation. They say, are these your books? He says, yes, they are. They say, are you ready to recant of your books? He said, what are you talking about? He said, all these books are wrong. You ready to recant? Said, well, let's talk about them one by one first. He wants to debate still. Which one? This one or this one? No, all of them. Well, no. But give me a day to think. So he goes, and that night he experiences, if we could have a reality show that peeks into history at a few points, this is one of the points I want the reality show. I want it in Martin Luther's room that night before the Diet of Worms, before he comes back. Because as he expresses himself up all night, as he expresses himself, he calls the fear and the anguish that he had affectum. And translators of this say there's no way to translate it in English. It's best left in German. Affectum. Why? Because it expresses a deep, deep, dark fear that is a demonic type fear that he's had all night.
Like the dark night of the soul would probably be a way to put it. It's a pretty small painting in reality, but we actually we sent it to a person in China that actually did a hand painting of it over here and blew it up. And so afterwards, if you want to look over here, you can see it up close and personal.
He finally comes back in. They ask him the same question. He says this: unless I am convinced from proofs from Scripture by plain reason and clear reasons of arguments, I can and will not recant. For it is neither safe nor wise to do anything against conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. The great Here I Stand speech, which was representative of the Reformation. The Reformation has happened. He has gone public, and the time is ripe, and it's not going to get taken away that easily as it did before. People begin to move. People begin to follow. And finally, we have what is called the Great Reformation between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. Protestant church is unfortunately named Protestant. We would like to still be named Catholic, okay? Because it's universal. That's the greatest name. I'm a Catholic. I love that name. That's my name. Can't take it. I don't like Protestant.
Well, because Protestant just means we are the ones who protest. We are the protesters against the church.
Briefly, these are the 5 solas of the Reformation. What is the basic theology? It is this. We believe that the Scripture is the final authority. It is the only infallible authority. Final and only infallible. Not the only authority. We still like the church. We still like reason. We still like experience and emotions. They all contribute.
Yeah.
But the Scripture trumps them all. Sola fide. Salvation is not by works. You cannot work your way to God. It is by faith alone. Sola gratia. It is the grace of Christ alone that saves us. That is the mechanism. Grace, stooping, undeserved favor. You deserve nothing. You get everything. Sola Christus. It is Christ alone. There is nobody else. No pope. No church that stands between us. Christ is here before you. You don't go through anybody else. And for God's glory alone. Not for the glory of the church. Not for St. Peter's Basilica. Not for the glory of the establishment. Not for the glory of the cardinals. It's for all of life is for God's glory alone. What is this all about, to sum up? Throughout the history, we have been watching. And we see the gospel. And we see it delivered to the saints. In this story, when Christ was hanging on the cross, we have this symbolic gesture that happens. There's a curtain, a big thick curtain hanging between the temple where you get to God and where the people are. All through the Old Testament, only priests could go back there. They had to wear bells to make sure they were still alive and tie something to their feet so that just in case they died and God struck them down, they had to pull them out. Scary, fearful thing. Christ comes to the cross, and when he dies and when he says it is finished, the veil of the temple rips. What does that mean? Here's God, people. He's accessible. Christ has made him accessible. Christ has bridged that way. No law can make you righteous enough. You go straight into the temple alone. Church history seems to be a process up to this point of us not getting it. We can't understand how great this is. And so slowly throughout church history, we've been weaving this back up. We've been sewing it back up to where the point it gets real high, during the last stages, the dark ages, the late Middle Ages, to where people just can't see above and get to God any longer, can't climb over it. Reformation comes in and essentially rips that open again. Symbolically, it's always been open.
Yeah.
Christ has always been accessible, but the knowledge of this, it's ripped open again. Sum up everything that we've done so far. You got the Bible delivered. You've got small creeds being placed in front of the Bible, a summary of the Bible. We called this the regula fide. Then we got a door that got shut on this. This door was to protect it, had all good intentions. We put men in front of it, to guard the door. They were the church. It was called the church. It was the Catholic Church. It became an institution. That institution made it to where they didn't even step behind the door anymore. The institution people didn't even know what was behind the door. Reformation comes in and basically does this, removes the door, places the institution or the church or the pastors, whatever it is, the leadership, the teachers, those who are called, beside the Bible, but behind it. Places the creed beside the Bible, but behind it. It's guarding it. The Bible is accessible to all of us. That's the Great Reformation. The Bible and God are here for you. You don't have to go through the church. He's accessible right now to you. Grace is accessible. Some of you have been trying, and you're failing and failing and failing. You can't get there. Right now, I tell you, God is standing here with the white robes of Christ, and he says, put these on. You say, what do I have to do? He says, nothing. Just take them. Put them on. That's what Christ did for you. I encourage everybody to do that right now. Learn from church history. This is it. This is our past. This is our DNA. Thanks for coming.